And I will begin with a chilly welcome for American commandos who've been deployed to Syria to allegedly help Turkish forces operating in the war-torn country. Now, footage from the border town of Rai shows Free Syrian Army militants driving out a group of U.S. troops, calling them crusaders, infidels, and dogs. Now, the militants, who've been long sponsored by Washington, gathered at the town's main square shouting anti-U.S. slogans. They voiced anger at Washington's support for Kurdish fighters battling Daesh. U.S. and militant sources confirmed the confrontation, which ended with U.S. troops making their way back toward the Turkish border. Now, the Pentagon says that it sent dozens of its special operations forces to cooperate with the Turkish military, which crossed the Syrian border last month under the pretext of fighting Daesh terrorists and Kurdish militia. Damascus has condemned Turkey's incursion as a breach of Syria's sovereignty. And joining us out of Australia for more on the story is Mrs. Mimi Al-Laham, Syrian activist and political commentator. Hi, Mimi. Nice to have you back on the Press TV again. Now, Mimi, U.S. involvement seems to only further complicate things on the ground, as we have the FSA, which is both U.S. and Turkey-backed. You have the Kurds, which are U.S.-backed and targeted by Turkey. You have the Kurds and the FSA, which don't get along with one another. Can you help us understand this seemingly complicated scenario?
Yeah, I think the Americans are trying to juggle several different interests at the same time. They have to contend with Turkey and the Syrian rebels, and at the same time, they have their agenda of creating a Zionist Kurdish state. And I say Zionist Kurdish state because the state that they envisage is going to be a pro-Israeli state, vassal state, that is one of the projects of the 1982 Israeli Union plan. So they have to juggle their NATO ally Turkey, which is of course opposed to this, as well as the Syrian rebels, which are naturally opposed to having a piece of their country divided, and at the same time support the Kurds. And it's not working out for them, obviously. They have completely lost support in most parts of Syria. The only support now that they could muster are from some Kurdish elements. And a lot of the Kurds that are actually fighting alongside them aren't necessarily Syrian Kurds. They can be Turkish and Iraqi Peshmerga. So really they have no support inside Syria, which is demonstrated by this video. The other thing that's demonstrated by the video is that all along the US has been backing people that, you know, may not be what the Americans would call, you know, something that they have interest in. In fact, a lot of these groups have been fighting alongside Al-Qaeda, and the rhetoric displayed in this video sort of, you know, goes alongside with that fact.
I mean, Mimi, the most important objective of the so-called U.S.-led coalition was supposedly to go after terrorism. I mean, what happened? I mean, it seems like we have all these twisted objectives where Daesh seems to be dropping down a few lines on that list of priorities. What happened to first eradicating terrorism and then dealing with these political objectives that the U.S. or Turkey may have?
You know, absolutely. The fact that it's confusing is because the Americans are speaking with forked tongues. And basically, we must ignore everything that they're saying because they've been the #1 sponsors of terrorism. And I'm speaking about, of course, the U.S. administration. You know, since the 80s, they created Al-Qaeda. They brought Al-Qaeda to Iraq. They, of course, brought Al-Qaeda and ISIS to Syria and are now openly backing it. So it just, the way to understand the situation is, in fact, to read the documents that are coming out of their think tanks. And all along, the project has always been for a new Middle East, which involves carving up the countries under sectarian lines and instilling sectarian hatred in the Middle East. That's always been the stated project of the US State Department. And if we look at things in that perspective, you know, supporting one side and the other side and having them fight each other, that's perfectly reasonable under the US, you know, objective.
And then you have Turkey. Ankara says its objective is to go after Daesh terrorists and Kurdish militants. But then when Daesh was right there in Kobani at a rock's throw from a Turkish border, they watched them massacre citizens in Kobani without even raising an eyebrow. But the second that there are Kurds in Jarablus, all of a sudden Turkey makes this incursion into Syria. Your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that the Turkish interests, in this scenario is, of course, to attack the Kurds and prevent any creation of a Kurdish state. Not so much to attack ISIS, that's just an excuse. In fact, attacking ISIS is an excuse for the Americans as well, whose main objective is to create a Kurdish state. So ISIS is really just a pawn. It's not really the main objective here, which is the Kurdish state.
A lot of people say for, pardon, I didn't mean to cut you off, but a lot of people say for Ankara, there's two objectives that come before going after Daesh. One is to overthrow Damascus, Syrian government, and the other is to go after Kurds, and they both are priorities for Ankara that come before going after terrorists.
I don't think Ankara has any objective to go after terrorists at all. I mean, I think that the only objectives that they have is the first two that you stated, preventing a Kurdish state, which, is not necessarily a bad thing, and actually it's a good thing, but also to overthrow the Syrian government. And unfortunately, those two things at the same time, it's almost impossible for that to happen. If you destabilize Syria, Syria might get divided by the United States. So Turkey has, since the beginning of the war, been in fact working against its own interests by supporting terrorists in Syria in order to destabilize it. So I would say that the Turkish objective to fight terrorism is just a cover for the first two objectives, and violating Syrian sovereignty in that way and creating their buffer zone to allow the rebels to take the area.
Thank you, Mimi, for your input. That's Mimi Allaham joining us out of Australia, Syrian activist and political commentator.